Hello and welcome to Istanbul Planning Agency's talks on corona pandemic and urbanization. My name is Murat Güney. I am a sociologist. I currently work in the Vision 2050 office of the Istanbul Planning Agency. In the Vision 2050 office, our purpose is to develop future plans and strategies for a more democratic, egalitarian, healthier, and greener Istanbul. Our another major purpose is to make Istanbul a more resilient city that can cope with crises and disasters such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, we discuss the issue with national and international experts and academics. Today, our guest is Professor Roger Keil. Professor Keil is a scholar at the Faculty of Environmental Studies program at York University in Toronto, Canada. His research is on global suburbanization, urban governance, and infectious diseases and cities. He is the author and editor of numerous books, including Network Disease, Emerging Infections in a Globalized City. So I have a copy with me. That book, Network Disease, was published in 2008. The book discusses the impact of globalization on the transmission of the SARS epidemic. It is a novel work on infectious disease management in a globalizing and urbanizing society. After the COVID-19 pandemic, that book is rediscovered and became popular again. And recently, Professor Keil wrote an article for the Bir Gün newspaper titled COVID-19 Pandemic in an Urban Planet. That is your first article translated to Turkish, right?
I believe it is. I have had a scholarly article translated, actually by Murat Uçoğlu, and one with Neil Brenner in the past, but I have actually never seen it. But I think this is my first piece that was ever in a daily newspaper in Turkey.
Yeah, it was very popular and it had a great impact, and I heard a lot from my friends and other academics, and they read it and gave comments. So thank you for that. And welcome, Roger. Thank you for joining us today. So the first question I want to talk about is the effect of globalization and urbanization on the COVID-19 pandemic. So in your Bir Gün article, you stated that, I quote, COVID-19 is the first pandemic affecting the population of an entirely urbanized planet. The corona pandemic hits most heavily major global cities and major connection points that have a large international airport, such as New York City, Moscow, or Istanbul. So we know that more than 60% of all infections in Turkey is in Istanbul. So did urbanization and globalization make us more vulnerable to viruses and pandemics? What might be possible future effects of that? Anti-globalization, smaller cities, movement to lower densities and peripheries. What do you think?
Well, thank you, Murat. I'm very grateful to Bir Gün to have published this article. It allowed me to summarize some of my thinking around infectious disease and globalized urbanization. And I'm honored by the fact that you are making the time, and the municipality of Istanbul shows an interest in this work. It is an amazing moment, of course, in which we all find ourselves, that we now speak across continents and oceans almost naturally through technology, and our ideas cross the world. And I think this is a moment that needs to also be recognized, that we are in the position now that we listen to one another. And I'm really happy that I have the opportunity to engage with the public in Turkey and the public in Istanbul, and with you in particular, because we have worked together in the past on questions like this. So thank you for that. When I chose the title for that Bir Gün article, and which is reflected in your question, I had in mind that the urbanization of the planet provides a blueprint for the spread of disease in the 21st century. The spreads of diseases around the globe happened before, but never in a world that was by majority an urban world, where the majority of people lived in something like an urban environment. And there are basically three dimensions to this phenomenon. first of all, as I just already indicated, the majority of humans now live in cities, live in urban environments of some kind. And that is important to understand because we live in an urban world, regardless of whether we live in a large city like Istanbul or Toronto for me, or whether we live in small towns or even in the countryside. We live urban lives. So that is important. The second point is that often these large cities, what we also sometimes call global cities, the financial centers, the command centers, the cultural metropoles, such as Istanbul, those cities are the nodal points, the centers of the global economy, of global culture, the geography of world trade. And those places are particularly vulnerable to infectious disease outbreaks. The role of airports, of course, stands supreme in this context. Istanbul is a place that knows that well because you have a new airport that is apparently the largest in the world by some measure. So that is important to keep in mind, that large cities are particularly susceptible to those kinds of outbreaks. But thirdly, since the urban is now everywhere and it extends to previously non-urbanized environments, think particularly of places in East Asia, in China, or in Africa, which are the most rapidly urbanizing parts of the world, then that also means that the urban frontier, where the urban pushes into non-urbanized environments, is also the frontier of disease. That has, for example, the effect that we see more and different types of so-called zoonotic diseases. And zoonotic diseases are the kinds that jump animal to human species boundaries. So, we have had many examples of that in the recent past. When we just don't use this language anymore so much, we call the scientific names of the disease, but we all have heard of the swine flu or the bird flu, avian flu. Those kinds of things indicate that a disease that we have in a human reservoir has previously been in an animal reservoir. And as the cities as urbanization pushes into those previously non-urbanized environments, of course we come in touch with all manner of natural environments, including animals that we previously were not in touch with on a regular basis. And but when we say the urban also exists in the periphery today, not just in the urban centers like Istanbul and Toronto, we also mean that it's the periphery of those cities. And that is a periphery in spatial terms, on the outskirts, on the geographic outskirts of these cities, but it also means the social peripheries. It means what my colleague Jay Pitter in Toronto calls the forgotten densities in the peripheries of those cities that we haven't paid much attention to. And I think it's really important that we see some of the problems currently in the COVID-19 outbreak related specifically to those social and spatial peripheries. So that is different from looking just at the global city, at the financial center. Now we're talking about a completely different kind of urbanization. But it also, of course, has effects on things like cruise ships or ski resorts. So it's not only the poorest and most peripheral populations that are affected. It's also those outliers of the urban economy that we create in tourism, such as on the global seas and on the highest mountains, areas that were previously only inhabited by very few people and that are now full. Every port is full with ships. Every valley in the Alps is full of people who seek ski tourism. So that is also something that needs to be taken into account. But it also may involve racialized populations. So when we talk about the urban periphery, we talk about those populations that have been discriminated against systematically because of their race, their ethnicity, their class. So those things, those peripheries existed before COVID-19 hit our urban environments, and we now pay, or the populations in those peripheries, of course, pay for that. It also includes institutional environments. In Canada, most cases, most deaths have occurred in long-term care homes. That includes homes for the elderly. You can say that we have peripheralized old age. We have made old age part of the periphery of our societies, which we don't see when there is no crisis. But now, as we have dozens of deaths, even in one or long-term care home, we cannot take our eyes away from that anymore. We need to look at that periphery. And the same is true for prisons, military camps. It is true, for example, also for indigenous reserves in North America, mining camps, those kinds of places that belong to the urban world. We cannot live in our urban world without those peripheries. Now we have to pay attention to them. And I think this is what we need to learn now that is different from previous pandemics. The urban is everywhere. It is connected to these nodes, and the urban is peripheral.
Yes, thank you. These are really very interesting points. My second question is about something we experience while we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is something global. So we experience a tension between central governments and local administrations. Again, in your article, you mentioned that, I quote, as urban centers and suburbanized regions saw the death toll rise in their disadvantaged neighborhoods, they gave up hope that an incompetent, uncaring, distant, and cynical government at the national level could provide needed assistance, unquote. The COVID-19 pandemic made such tensions between the local and central governments very visible, especially in America. The conflict between the Trump's federal administration and New York's local administration in dealing with the pandemic was very dramatic. In Turkey too, the central government was unable to reach all those who are in need, couldn't distribute enough masks, food, financial aid, and yet at the same time blocked help and fundraising campaigns of municipal government that are taken control by the opposition after the local elections a year ago. Despite such political pressure, Istanbul municipality developed novel ways to reach out those who are in need and deliver them assistance as much as possible. So in what direction do you think that such tension will lead us, that tension between central and national governments and local municipal administrations? Will this lead us to more centralization and authoritarianism, or will local governments, or can they develop new ways to be more self-sustainable and act more autonomously while dealing with similar crises in the future? What can we learn as a local administration from that COVID pandemic?
Yeah, this is a very central question, and to some degree, we cannot answer that question right now because this is an unforeseen situation. Most governments in the world have taken on incredible debt right now to deal with this pandemic. These are the kinds of measures that are now taken that often people have demanded governments take when it comes to climate change, or, other kinds of issues. And governments were unwilling to make those kinds of commitments. Right now, in many parts of the world, particularly those parts of the world where governments act responsibly, and there have been right-wing governments and left-wing governments that have acted responsibly, and there have been a few governments that have acted entirely irresponsibly and have let the pandemic become a threat to their populations. We can look at the United States, the federal government of the United States, in that light. Clearly, there's evidence to say that that government did not live up to its responsibilities that it should have taken. But it is too early to say how this will be playing out in the future. And some of it has to do with the strategic choices that societies now have to make. In my country, for example, in Canada, the economy has shown to be dependent on sectors such as the resource industry. And so the federal government and some provincial governments, what is called states in the United States, or Länder in Germany is called provinces in Canada. This is the next level down in the federal hierarchy. Many of those provinces have resource economies to protect. The federal government safeguards those resource economies. Much of that is now in oil and gas, but there are also other ones in forestry and so on. Those kinds of economies are completely different from the urban economies of the software industry, the creative industries, the arts, education, healthcare sector. These are very different economies following very different logics. So as we come out of this pandemic, we have to have a conversation across these levels of government, whatever the political interests are. We have to come to terms to say, well, if we want an urban economy in Toronto or in Montreal or in Vancouver or in Istanbul or in Berlin that lives up to the promise of less automobile use, more connectivity, greater community life, healthier food choices, better housing. If we want all those things, perhaps we cannot live off the mortgage of the debt we are incurring in our natural environments. We cannot pump oil out of the ground as much as we did in the past. We cannot build pipelines across the land the way we used to do it. We need to weigh those different kinds of things. And governments are invested into those different kinds of economies in different ways. And it depends a little bit, of course, then in the end on the politics of it all. So the question is, to what degree more democratic, more progressive forms of politics can use this moment, and many of those will be urban political movements, urban social movements, urban democratic challenges to more hierarchical ways of organizing things. If this is the moment in which cities can become the arena for new claims that are being staked in this moment of change, then perhaps we can see a different kind of outcome and different relationships between those. The Canadian state is a colonial state. It's a colonial settler state. So the entire architecture, its hierarchy, is built on this understanding of colonizing the land, of extracting resources from that land, and of exporting those resources to places. It used to go to France and to England, which were the colonial powers for the last 150 years. Most of it went to the United States. Now a lot of it goes to China. This is the way that our country works. And I'm sure you could have a similar kind of conversation about Turkey or the European Union or any other country that we might be looking at. So how countries are organized and how the hierarchies and silos of decision-making are organized will have to depend to some degree on the political decisions made on all levels of those countries. And how open the federal or central level of a government is to democratic pressure may be different from how open a city like Toronto or Istanbul is to democratic pressure.
I see. Yeah, thank you. So my third question is, I want to return to the peripheries again and question urban inequality and its relation to COVID-19. So again, you wrote that, I quote, "It is some of the weakest, most marginal and peripheral communities that have been most affected." So the pandemic clearly made urban inequalities more visible. As you say, it also affected people in the cruise ships. The first ones, especially who were affected by the virus, were like the most mobile people in the globalized world, such as artists, celebrities, politicians. But yet, in a short while, the rich found ways to secure themselves, while the poor and vulnerable populations were exposed heavily to the virus. In a recent article by New York Times, for 40% of population of rich neighborhoods of New York City left the city. So, and the virus mostly affected racial minorities and economically vulnerable populations. For a long time, for Istanbul, we didn't have a detailed map of the effects of coronavirus, but recently the government published that. So, and according to that map, it's very clear that the poorest neighborhoods of Istanbul that are also very densely populated, these are those that are mostly affected by the virus. So like there is a very common cliche nowadays. People say nothing will be the same after the pandemic. So will the pandemic be opportunity to overcome these ongoing urban inequalities so that nothing will be the same? Or unlike the cliche, will everything be the same or even worse in terms of urban inequalities?
Yeah, this is, again, another central question that we have to deal with collectively. We have to deal with it. It's an intellectual problem, but it's mostly a political problem. It's a question of what we can do. So if we say nothing will be the same, and there seems to be a collective wish around the world that this may be a moment in which we can make the social conditions dance and change, if that is the case, we must be aware of the fact that we cannot let the virus do the work for us. The virus is the virus is the virus. It is not, it's one agent in a very complex set of relationships. In the end, the important thing for us to remember is that a pandemic is not a natural event. The virus is a natural thing. It is not even a life form in like an animal or a plant or a human being. It is dependent on the host that carries it from place to place, and it's dependent on organisms from which it lives. But it is a physical force. Of course, it is a physical force. But a pandemic is dependent on human agency. So in a majority urban world, again, we can say that human agency is first of all, urban agencies, the agency of urban actors. So the question of what we can do as residents in that urban world is a question we have to ask ourselves regardless of the virus and the pandemic and the so-called coming out of the pandemic. So the number one question to me is, how do we imagine the past to have been, and how do we imagine the future to be different from that past? For those people who did well before the virus hit, they will see very little reason to change things up. And for those who did not do so well, we can assume that also their political power was probably less than that of those people who did well. So as we are inching towards some form of normalcy, we need to pay attention to those whose voices were not heard, who were systematically and structurally disadvantaged in that old normal. So when we move to the new normal and move to a new social contract, a new social fabric, new social relationships after the pandemic, we need to do a lot of affirmative action to enable and empower and put into track those kinds of changes that will inevitably change for the better the conditions of those that were the victims of the inequalities of the old order. And if we don't do that, if we fail that it would be a historical fail. There could even be a worse outcome from that we could actually end up with a world post-pandemic in which those who were most privileged before are even more privileged after. And that is, of course, the example that you give of those who have the ability to leave the urban centers and, attempt to protect themselves. Of course, the virus will not stop at the gates of the protected places. The virus, as a physical force, can move anywhere it wants, in any body it wants. And so in the end, that will not save the rich, or it will not save the wealthy to separate themselves from the rest of society. But as the rich have been separating themselves in the past 3 or 4 months, they have also separated their capital, put it into safe places. They've also made sure that the real estate market in which they have invested is in a secure place, that they're attempting to lay out a landscape of post-pandemic that is to their advantage, to their benefit. And here we can do a lot of things differently. I like to use the example of housing. If we look at housing as a universal issue, a lot of cities have experienced housing shortages. In many large cities of the world, the housing market is so uneven that the poorest pay the highest percentage of their monthly income for the lowest quality housing available. Now, in many parts of the world, housing has been the spearhead of neoliberalization. The financialization of the housing market is perhaps the single best example of how neoliberalization has worked, even after the 2008 and 2009 world financial crisis. A lot of it has been linked to the idea of home ownership, of owning the house, owning the apartment, owning the condominium that we have. And many people are, of course, in debt. Our colleague Murat Uçoğlu, of course, is currently writing his dissertation about exactly this topic. So we're all indebted more than previous generations have been, without the possibility to easily deal with that debt. Now, there are other examples. And one example is the city of Berlin in Germany, in which 80% of the people, 85%, are renters. And the world has taken notice that in the city of Berlin, both through the social movements of tenants, but also now through responsible municipal governments, the rights of tenants have become to be protected against the buyout of rental apartments by large real estate corporations, so-called REITs, REITs, the protection in terms of rent controls of these apartments, to create some sort of sustainable social standing for tenancy, which, in my country, in my city where I live, where 50% are tenants in Toronto, often renting is just seen as a transitory phase to home ownership, while in Berlin or in Zurich and places like that, renting is considered the normal way of living in the city. So the whole world can currently learn from how Berlin has changed the conversation about one's housing situation. It is a completely different situation when you give tenants the right to maintain their housing as a stable place in which they can count on the rent not rising dramatically over the next foreseeable future. It's a completely different environment from the completely out of control rental markets that you see in other parts of the world, where it is often, as I said, the poorest that suffer the most in that marketplace. So this is one place where I've seen almost a global outcry amongst tenant movements from Oakland, California, to Berlin, to East Asia, and in Africa also, where people think differently about tenure, tenancy, those kinds of things, because it has been shown that a lot of the so-called forgotten densities that I mentioned are in high density rental environments where people have suffered the most. And I think this is a critical outcome, that we now have a global universal conversation about tenure, about home ownership, about the right to the city as a right to housing, and linked to, of course, questions of income. You know, the fact that the poor are paying such a high percentage of their income for rent has to do with the fact that they're not making enough money. And that is linked to that other question about, you know, who are not only the forgotten densities, but also the forgotten parts of our labor markets, which are exactly the service workers that have kept our cities going as they were in lockdown, who have been the personnel in the hospitals, who have provided public transit, even in the crisis, and all those people who are underpaid, who have insecure jobs, who've been driven out of the most gentrified neighborhoods of cities. All of that are important areas in which we can make a change. The virus has just triggered that change, but now we need to take over and enable for those changes to take effect and to become sustainable. And it's really important for us to understand that many of those areas are areas of everyday life, and many of those areas are in the power of municipal government to change. Not all of them, but municipal government is particularly positioned to make changes in those areas of everyday urban life.
Yes, yeah, great. So, like, as a planning agency, we are also examining different plans. Like Berlin is, as you said, an interesting example, and like we need to learn a lot from other examples. So, like, my final question is, I think you also somehow answered that question, but just maybe we can repeat some points. So questions about urban planning. So you already discussed like home ownership, tenants questions, how social workers and like city employees were also vulnerable populations, disadvantaged populations left behind by modern urban planning. So can COVID pandemic be and you said that like it can be an opportunity to rethink how we design our cities. So while cities are preparing to reopen, what can we propose in order to not to reproduce but alleviate urban inequalities when we think about like urban plans?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I've been thinking a lot about this, and my colleague Sean Hurdle here in Toronto and I have recently written about this in a very practical manner. These are practical questions of what we can do. Exactly. They're not philosophical, they're practical. And so I think the most important and most positive outcome of this current pandemic in terms of urban planning could be if the measures now proposed in the current situation make us more resilient to future disease outbreaks, but also have some overlap with the kinds of agendas that were already in place when the pandemic hit with regards to the climate emergency. Right? So this is the big agenda item that must not be forgotten, is the climate emergency. The pandemic is an aspect of this, and it's partly related to climate change, as it is to urbanization, but those things are dependent on one another to some degree. But now we need to forge a common agenda. So when we now propose changes to the way we live in cities or the way we do urban planning in the future, we need to keep in mind that this is a long-term goal for us of creating more climate resilient cities also. So this will obviously involve turning more of the city over to pedestrians, bicyclists, and public transit. We must not lose public transit. A lot of public transit systems are under financial stress right now. People are, not as open to using public transit as they were in the past for obvious reasons. I think this will pass and people will go back onto the subway, back onto the bus to the degree that they did before the pandemic. So it's important to continue strengthening those things and push back the automobile. That was already on the agenda. The virus helped to highlight this kind of thing because of social distancing and all that. And it's also important to keep on building more dense, compact, and healthier cities, the way we have talked about it for years now, right? But that's not enough. The most effective and far-reaching programs in urban planning that resist a warming or the effects of a warming planet, they are exactly those that we need also in order to soften the blow of future pandemics. And that means we need more investment, public investment, more care for the social and technical infrastructures that we need to build to have more resilient cities and better cities to live in. And that is really the critical point. We cannot let us strip social services to the minimum, as many cities have done in the past. And we can see those cities who have not done as much stripping to their social and health services in the past generation have done better in this pandemic. Those communities who were not as vulnerable to begin with did better in the current pandemic. So we have to learn from that. We have to learn that a generation of austerity and neoliberalism needs to end. We need to finally make these investments again, that we need to sustain the social fabric of our cities. In the past generation, there was a lot of talk about amenities for the creative class and to pick winners. That the idea was, if we support the most creative and most productive classes, often the young in society, if we create strength for those sectors of the economy, then all the others will follow and will sort of be risen in the general manner. I don't think that worked quite that way. We have left many people behind as the creative class has risen to the top, and even those people in the creative class now have problems sustaining urban lifestyles like the ones that were meant to live. So those people who were able to pay for services through private agencies, through private offerings in the medical services, but also in other types of urban services, like getting around the city, for example, those used to do quite well. We used to put a lot of investment into those types of sectors. Let's think about the whole sharing economy, for example, in that context. We had Airbnbs and mobility services such as Uber and Lyft. These are different in different kinds of cities, but we managed to give them responsibility for how we were mobile, how we were housed, how we would be living when we were visiting other places. I think we need to rethink this now and think more about strengthening the structural elements of our societies, the way it was done in many European societies after the Second World War, the way it is still, I hesitate to use that example too much, but we can see that the Scandinavian countries have been doing better, even though Sweden perhaps has made an experiment that had some unexpected effects. But it is clear that if we strengthen the social fabric of these market-based societies, you do better than letting the market free, giving the market free rein. And what better instrument than urban planning to use to provide these kinds of measures? Urban planning is basically made to do that sort of thing. It can be the counterweight to the market. It can give direction to the market. And again, let's think about housing. Urban planning can direct housing in the city. It can make demands on the developers when they come into the city. Now, that's a different situation, of course, in Turkey than in many other countries in the world because of the predominance of state-organized housing production, and that has to be taken into account. Singapore is a similar case, Hong Kong to some degree. we need to learn from one another what works, what doesn't work. How can we create the bones of that social fabric in better ways? And planning, again, has to go back to school and to learn. But planning education also has to be following suit, which means for me as a university teacher who teaches in a planning program, I teach in the largest planning program in Canada, we need to change our curricula to reflect those values, that we cannot expect that to happen automatically. We need to build into our learning process new guidelines, new ideas about what planning can do in society. Much of that is a generational change now, because planning had a hard time after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Planning wasn't really at the top of the agenda. It was all about the market and all about giving free rein to the market and let the market decide how to provision urban societies. This has left, of course, many societies in a highly unequal state. Now planning is coming back in a big way. We have new programs of funding. We have new willingness for the governments at all levels, from municipal all the way to the national level, but even perhaps at the global level, as we see through organizations like the C40 Organization of Mayors, or the World Health Organizations, which is now, of course, under criticism of, again, the Americans to some degree. But it is a global to local coordination that is necessary in bringing the best out of urban planning as a practice. But as I said, it's not a philosophical question, it's not rocket science. These are very practical measures that we can take, and we have to have the courage to make those changes.
Yes, great. These are great points. Thank you for your contribution. So we need to a little bit contemplate on all those points. But I think it was a really great conversation. Thank you very much again for your contribution. So we would like to also have you again in Istanbul one day, maybe in the near future, after we adjust to the new normal. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Murat. I would love to come to Istanbul. It's on top of my list of places to go once I come out of isolation in my own country, in my own city. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.